Welcome to The Dirt, an economics podcast bringing you the down and dirty agronomic science behind growing better crops and bigger returns. Backed by Nutrien-economics.com, we break down the latest research, news, and insights to help farmers make better business decisions. Let's dig in.
Hello, and welcome back to The Dirt. Thank you for tuning in this week. I am your host, Amy Crozier, Senior Marketing Representative with Nutrien. And today I'm excited to dig into today's episode. We have a familiar voice, our favorite weatherman, Eric Snodgrass. Thanks a lot, Eric, for joining us again. And for those listeners who don't know you, why don't you just take a moment and introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So again, Eric Snodgrass. I am Nutrien's Senior Science Fellow. I'm an atmospheric scientist. Before I came to Nutrien, I was a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois. Been here now since 2019. And I forecast weather every day. We're watching it for growers. We make tools. We try to answer questions about how weather's impacting production ag. It's fun. I mean, the weather's a mystery, right? I mean, it's amazing how quickly it can change and honestly how poorly we are at trying to figure out what it's going to do next. But I guess that's what keeps me in a job because there's always some new problem to solve the next day.
So let's kick off with just the big picture. You were on in April and you talked about in the lower 48, there is drought. So What does that drought map look like right now? And are we still chasing moisture?
Yeah, good question. So right now, as of our recording here, mid-July, we're chasing moisture in the Western Corn Belt. All the storms have run north of it or south of it, but the Western Corn Belt's been extremely dry. And they just went through a week of triple-digit heat, and it's caused a flash drought scenario. But from when we talked in April till now, we did see pretty good drought recovery in some key growing areas, specifically in pockets of the Midwest, the lower Mississippi River Valley. And lately, we've even had some drought relief up the East Coast. We have a lot of business, of course, in Georgia, North South Carolina, and up in Virginia. And so to see storms finally get into that area to relieve the drought is very, very good. A lot of the drought has moved farther to the west into the Rocky Mountains. You've probably seen some of the big wildfires that have taken shape in like Utah, in New Mexico, and even in Colorado this year. Although, as we are here in the middle of July, the biggest fires are actually in Ontario, and they have been absolute monsters. So what's really happened, Amy, is we've kind of just like redistributed where the drought is. And that's what happens in the middle of summer. It just kind of moves around. And the question's always, is it on the most productive acres, or does it move to areas that don't really impact, the ag business as much as it could? And so, we're watching for quite a bit of it. But I'm going to tell you this, on the flip side of this, if we go away from drought and talk about rain, which I'm sure we'll talk more about in a few minutes, I've been absolutely amazed at how hyper-local the flooding has been this summer. Like we've seen it across the Canadian prairie. I mean, from the mountains in Alberta all the way over to Ontario. We've had flooding in my home state of Illinois. I mean, we had some places in Illinois that in the month of June picked up a foot of rain. And then right now we're talking about probably a disastrous event taking shape in southern Texas, down in the hill country down there, where in the last, 5 or 6 days, I've got a few places that are approaching 30 inches of rainfall. And that amount of rainfall in that region is going to cause massive flooding and major problems, and unfortunately going to put some lives at risk. And so it's been quite the inequitable distribution of rainfall that has been most of my summer forecasting job.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm up in Alberta, and we broke the 1914 record with rainfall, and it's been challenging. But you drive across the prairies and you see south, the crops are looking great, and then you see pockets where we're identifying waterfowl instead of looking at crops. So it's been quite the variety. In April, you also talked about the Missouri Basin and about having a low snowpack, and we're really dependent on those spring rains. How did that play out?
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the lack of snow in winter can give you cause to worry about summer drought if spring doesn't fix the problem. And in many places along the Missouri River, spring did. Now, if we start right at the end of the Missouri River in Missouri, they had tremendous amounts of flooding across the river, and especially in the northern part of the state. But then you get over to where it is in Nebraska, and it was super dry. South Dakota did okay. Montana had incredible June rains. So you kind of look across the entire river basin, and I just drove over it yesterday, actually. I was up in Pierce, South Dakota, and I saw the river there, and it was flowing just fine. Yet I've also found folks that are into some of the tributaries into that river system farther to the south of that river flow. And they're like, man, we are so deep in drought. We would love to get anything to help us recover this. And that's one of the complexities of these massive river systems, of which the United States has one of the biggest in the world, with the Mississippi and then the Ohio and the Missouri on either side funneling into it. And so, yes, those river systems are fragile, and we like to watch them to give us a good indicator on how a season is behaving with respect to precipitation.
So you also mentioned, too, like there was a split between east and west. What does that look like now?
I probably should have told you the split was more north-south. But at the time, we were seeing this, everything shape up where east of the Mississippi was looking wetter and west of the Mississippi was looking drier. But then as we got into the month of June, it was almost the whole Mississippi basin was looking really, really wet. And to be honest with you, Amy, it started to bring in another part of the weather risk conversation, in that years that have really, really wet conditions across the south in the United States or up the Mississippi basin, which 2026 has been, high leaf wetness hours tends to increase the risk of disease pressure. And so we got the word out early in June, like, hey, it was the second week of June, I'm blasting out all across the company's channels, like, we have got high leaf wetness hours. It's been very humid. We've had a lot of precipitation. This means mold spores and all those different fungal pressures, they're going to be able to move farther to the north. And already we were seeing indications of tar spot and all sorts of, rust and all sorts of other fungal pressure on corn and soybeans showing up, which, because we were caught it early, I think a lot of folks were able to get out there and do additional passes of fungicide. But so that's what I meant by north-south. We kind of had this south wet, and then the northern plains were dry. And so it there it is again. In April, I thought, it'd be east-west, and turns out it was more like this than this. And that's the nature of the business. It's hard to predict out there beyond a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I've seen lots of planes going overhead, a lot of fungicides going on, and with those wet conditions. And you also talked about we're potentially watching one of the biggest El Niños in history. So how did that play out?
Yeah, this El Niño has been growing rapidly. In fact, it's one of the fastest, actually I think it is the fastest transition from a La Niña to an El Niño that we've ever observed. And if you look across the equatorial Pacific, which is where we kind of monitor for El Niño events, and by the way, it's 7,000 miles of open ocean, just to be clear here. It's a huge area. But the changes in the temperatures have been quite dramatic. This El Niño, as of mid-July, is already in what we would consider a strong category. Normally, they don't really advance to this until you get into autumn, but this one's a bit early. And there's still quite a bit of warm water that will continue to upwell, making this probably our strongest El Niño event in history when you compare it to all of the other big events. Like we had one in 23, one in 15, one in 97, 82. These were all big El Niño events. Now, the question is, I can just jabber on and on and on about all these kind of things, but what does it even mean? Well, why do we even care? Well, when you take water of a certain temperature and then you redistribute it across the equatorial Pacific or Atlantic, it shifts global weather patterns, because all of our weather, all of it, is born out of the fact that the planet is round, despite what you might see on Facebook. Trust me, it's a round planet. But because it's round, all the heat gets kind of trapped in the equator and has to go into the northern end of the southern hemisphere. Well, as that's occurring, if there's any sort of redistribution of the ocean temperatures underneath that, you can change where the biggest, baddest thunderstorms show up along the equator, and that changes the way the jet stream works. So right now, all of the momentum in the jet stream as this El Niño has been building, it's in the southern hemisphere. So it's hit Australia. In fact, right now as we're talking, we've got a piece of the jet stream that's left Australia and heading over toward Chile. So this is going across the southern Pacific Ocean at an average speed of 250 miles an hour. And we're expecting 30 to 40 inches of rain up against the Andes in Chile right now because of that. Now, where we are in the northern hemisphere, well, the Earth has to conserve momentum. So if all the speed is in the southern hemisphere due to this El Niño, it's being stolen from the northern hemisphere. So what has it done? It's slowed down the flow, giving you hyperlocal, very heavy rainfall, which is why you have ducks in your backyard. It's giving the Western Corn Belt no rainfall because there's a big ridge protecting it, a big dome of heat, and they're just dying for a thunderstorm in there. The thunderstorms are all running around the ridge of that, which is why it's flooding in Texas. So it is all one big, massive connected system. system. And what you have to remember about El Niños is that usually in summer, we aren't talking too much about their influence. It's in autumn, it's in fall, it's in next spring that we think El Niño is really going to take over and be the most dominant piece of the weather forecasting conversation.
Wow, that's very interesting. So what does that mean then for the hurricane season?
So this is kind of neat. If an El Niño shows up, what it tends to do is it tends to bring winds which go across the equator from the east to the west. We call them trade winds. It tends to reverse those. And what that does is that repositions this pressure, the pressure pattern, and hence the winds, and tends to increase the wind shear over the Caribbean, over the main development region in the Atlantic. We call it the MDR, the main development region, or over the Gulf. And what that typically does is it disrupts any sort of tropical development. So generally speaking, El Niños tilt hurricane season toward the odds of fewer and weaker systems. Doesn't mean you can't get one. I mean, you can still have big hurricanes during El Niño years, but they're more difficult to come by. What we're hoping, though, because we've honestly had a lot of flooding along the Gulf Coast this year, is that we hold off any sort of worry about tropical systems for a while, simply because it's been so wet, like we talked about the flooding in Texas recently. So yeah, it tends to suppress the hurricane season.
Well, that's good news for at least we're not watching out for some major hurricane season. You also talked about El Nino, and it usually means for drier Australia. And you said the growers there are going to be watching it over the next 9 months, what that means for them. So what is happening in Australia right now?
Yeah, well, this is a very, very good point. So remember, they're in winter and when we're in summer. Okay. The biggest impact of an El Nino for the southern hemisphere is going to come in their spring and in their summer. For us, it's autumn and winter. For them, it's spring and summer. So we were telling the folks down in Australia, like, look, we know El Nino is going to be in the forecast, but this is not going to affect you the way you think it might in June and July, which is the heart of their winter. So they've actually had some pretty wet conditions. In fact, there's this inland lake there called Lake Eyre, and it's actually at the highest water depth and also greatest extent it's been in decades. And so they're actually wet right now. The problem is going to be as we go toward their spring, which is, of course, our fall, as we go toward their spring, we start to see the weather patterns blowing more dry interior air across the continent, and it tends to give them greater risk of having drought in their eastern growing areas. So think Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, maybe even to Tasmania, and also South Australia. They tend to have drier conditions. So right now they're all bracing for what could be drought building in their spring and following summer after having pretty darn good winter precipitation across broad areas. Now, in Australia, you got to remember, they're on the receiving end of every El Nino. So if you want to think of the two spots in the world that have the greatest influence, think like Australia, Indonesia, that region, and then Peru. That's the starting and stopping point of these big El Nino events. So they're very concerned about where this can go as we go forward. And I've had to tell them, I'm like, look, this El Nino may take us into some unprecedented territory. So every forecast you hear and every forecast that I give you, I would ask that you take it with a grain of salt, especially when we look at the longer term. And I also tell them, like, don't be reactionary to big weather forecasts, because you're going to have a lot of meteorologists, to be honest with you, some of them just swing for the fences because they want the clicks and the views, and they are not giving you a really good tempered, measured view of what the weather is actually doing. And sometimes that hype can be addictive. I'll be honest with you. I've seen a lot of folks just feeding off of all the chaos around weather, when I think the wisest thing to do is to step back, watch things unfold as they do, and make more calculated decisions about it.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's when it comes down to agriculture and farming, it's all about managing your risks, and I think that's great advice. You also mentioned in April too about there was a late seeded saffron corn crop in Brazil. How's that played out, and how does that impact the markets? And you also talked about the European wheat market. Can you dive in a little bit into that one?
Yeah, so the safrinha corn crop in Brazil, specifically throughout the Cerrado, did go in a little bit late. The rain kind of ended a little early. We would have expected them to pull way back on total production numbers. So, how many millions of bushels or metric tons as they like to measure it. But it wasn't newsworthy. and they've still got a crop out. They're still harvesting it right now in the middle of their dry season. So in other words, the South American story was kind of a dud. We across North America, we're kind of hoping for something to shake our prices up early in the season, but it wasn't a big enough splash to really do that. But across parts of Western Europe, Spain, getting into France, they had extremely dry conditions throughout late spring into early summer. Some of the worst quality wheat crop we've seen out of that area in a long time. We have a measurement called NDVI, which is where our satellites try to measure plant health. It was setting new record lows across France. Parts of Great Britain were extremely hot and dry. But then you go over to the other side of Europe toward Ukraine, the Russian wheat belt. And you're going to be pretty hard pressed to find widespread problems. And if you kind of split Europe in half, West versus East, you're going to find that the production out of Western Europe compared to like Ukraine and Russia, they're not really on the same level. And as a result, we're not hearing too big of a story other than the fact that it's been so hot and dry in parts of Western Europe, specifically France and England as of late. Now, the big question I'm going to have, Amy, is we're in the middle of a dry season in South America. So let's go back south of the equator. They're not allowed to do anything. They can't plant any crops until they get into September. Some folks are allowed to plant September 1. Most have to wait to September 15. Okay. If this El Niño plays out the way we think it's going to play out, there is cause to think that we're going to delay the planting of their first crop of soybeans. They want to get that planted in October and November. Really, they want to be done by the end of November. And what we have to think about is any delay in the planting of soybeans sets off their entire crop calendar. Now, this is important for Nutrien. We have business down there, so we don't want this to occur. But if I'm a U.S. farmer and I'm watching prices, anything to upset the Brazilian market is typically good for a U.S. farmer. So there's always this back and forth between these two major production areas. So here's what I know. If the El Niño comes on and is as strong as anticipated, we expect as we go into September and October, November, for there to be very wet conditions in southern Brazil. So states like Paraná or Rio Grande do Sul, Santa Catarina, or even Sao Paulo, those areas tend to be wet. And then immediately to the north of it, just like you and I were talking about in the United States, where the drought's right next to the flooding, we expect through the Cerrado, so think like Bahia, Minas Gerais, or you go into Goiás, Tocantins, and then the big one, Mato Grosso, they may be a little drier than average, especially in October and early November. And if that's the case, they'll wait to plant soybeans. It will not affect the soybean crop. The soybean crop will still get its full chance at growing and everything, but it'll delay the planting, of that safrinha crop, which is corn, later in the season, and that could be problematic. One, because it affects when the crop comes out, therefore it affects global supply and the shipping of it. And the second is if it finishes under very dry conditions, I'm talking next April, May, and June. If it finishes under dry conditions, it could peel back on the yield. But honestly, all these questions are great, but the biggest one we have to consider is, will Brazil continue to add somewhere between 3 and 4% additional acreage this upcoming growing season like they've been doing for at least the last decade? If they do, the added acres offset weather problems easily. And we're just waiting to see what those intentions are going to look like. My guess is that they're going to go after more acres again this year.
Yeah, that's interesting because we're always watching when we're looking at the markets is for a disaster in somebody else's backyard to improve our prices, improve our carryout of stocks of grain crops or soybeans. And so we're always watching that. And so when we shift back to the U.S., you were talking last time about the Elvis rule and watching that Memphis Nashville corridor. And how is that impacting that corn belt?
Yeah, so it was wet there in April and May. Not crazy wet, not like it was a year ago, but there was plenty of moisture in the lower Mississippi River Valley in the Mid-South. So guess what? We got into the month of June, and it was wet from Iowa all the way over to Indiana and Ohio. So we just had plenty of rain to the north of it. And that's what's bought us time in the month of July to keep this heat that we're dealing with here now, not just tearing our crops apart and causing major problems. Now, the Elvis rule only applies April and May to predict June and early July. So the Elvis rule is now over. We got to go on to think about other things. And the big topic is going to be where what we call ridge riders are going to be. In fact, I should get like a leather jacket that says ridge riders on the back and buy a motorcycle and ride around in it. But in the middle of summer, the jet stream likes to just block up into these big giant ridges, and storms run all over the edge of them. And this is why you've seen so much rain. This is why parts of, southern Saskatchewan and also Manitoba have seen plenty of rain. All of those ridge riding storms have gone through that area. In fact, by the way, not to deviate from this, but did you see this was in Alberta, and I forgot the name of the lake, darn it. But there's a team of researchers in the United States that chases tornadoes with drones. It's called the Otus Project, OTUS Project. By the way, just go look it up on YouTube. Anybody that's listening, go do this. They flew a drone into a tornado going over a lake and had a rainbow in the foreground. It's like the most photogenic thing I've ever seen. But that tells you where the storms are. They've been in the southern Canadian prairie, but they've missed like the Red River Valley of the North. They've missed parts of South Dakota, and they've also missed Ontario, where all those terrible fires are right now. But so Elvis rules out. We're now watching what we call the ridge running or ridge riding thunderstorms. And if you're in the Midwest, you want the ridge to go as far west as you can take it. Like if you could put it over Nevada, that's perfect. But if that ridge hangs out too close to the middle part of the United States, we tend to see flash drought situations taking over, like what's happening right now in South Dakota.
Interesting. So we have had tornadoes in Alberta and a lot of tornado warnings, and I am definitely going to go check that out and for the beautiful rainbow and tornado. Rainbows and
it's
not
amazing.
so much sunshine there. So when you're looking at weather risks then for the northern states and for Canada, what are we watching for? What should we expect going forward?
So one of my big concerns in the U.S. right now, especially for some of our major crops like corn and soybeans, is we've had some very warm overnight lows. And we know that the crop, it needs to, for lack of a better way of saying it needs to rest at night. We need the crop to be able to turn off its respiration processes, and to do that to conserve energy. And of course, it's all about energy. It's about the movement of sugar to put it into a kernel or into a seed. Well, when it's too hot at night, that process doesn't shut down, and therefore the crop is expending more of its energy staying cool and staying alive than making grain. And so I don't like the fact that we've had such warm and humid and muggy nights. We need to cool things off and get a little drier air in place. The temperatures are backing off. They're backing off for Canada, they're backing off for the U.S., and they're all going into the Pacific Northwest with much, much hotter conditions into early next week. The problem is the Northwest, we don't want all that additional heat this time of year. To be 7 to 10 degrees above average in like Washington and the Columbia Basin, it's too hot. We don't want that. But it's always a sacrifice. Like you said a moment ago, someone's going to have the bad weather at the expense of someone else having the good weather. So the cool down that's coming from the Canadian prairie through the Midwest is needed, but it's at the expense of the Northwest. Now, what I've learned from the 2026 growing season is the weather pattern has been kind of on this 8 to 10 day cadence. So it's like, here's 8 to 10 days of heat, and then we back it off with cooler weather. Or you might get 8 to 10 days of like nonstop storms, and then you get a little bit of a reprieve from that, which means as we go through the rest of July and into the month of August, we're in a reprieve time period right now with some cooler weather. At least it's going to start soon. And then I expect it to jump right back up. And most of our forecasts are trying to keep most of August from the Canadian prairie through the central United States with above average temperatures, which if they stay too warm, especially overnight, could start to peel back on some of these national yield numbers that are being projected right now.
So then, generally, what's on your radar going into the harvest season?
Well, there's a couple of big things. Between now and harvest, we are at the time of year, this would be July and August, where we have the most common type of thunderstorm are called squall lines, or MCSs, mesoscale convective storm systems. That's the nerd speak for straight line winds, okay? When you get into this time of year, our storms tend to be more linear in their shape rather than individual storm clusters. And when they do that, they can produce a lot of straight line wind damage should they take off. So just as a reminder, think August of 2020 in Iowa. I think it was August 10th. We had the big derecho that went across and knocked out 7.5 million acres. That's just one example of many of these types of storms. So until we get there, my biggest worry is when the ridge riders come through, are they linear in shape and they therefore produce some strong straight line winds? That's number one. Number two is we must continue to fight the disease pressure because of how high the humidity has been, the leaf wetness hours, and the movement of a lot of those fungal pressures farther to the north. So like you said, we're doing a lot of fungicide passes here in the United States as well to try to mitigate the loss, due to that. The farther we go toward harvest, now this is really quite important, El Nino is going to become a bigger story. And the way you need to think about El Ninos is when we transition into fall, all that speed and momentum I told you earlier that was like leaving Australia, going into Chile, that all comes to the Northern Hemisphere. And what it tends to do is it tends to shove our jet stream across the United States and across southern Canada at greater velocities, greater speed. What we tend to get out of that is we tend to have more opportunity to get wetter weather as you approach October and November. Now, where I live in Illinois, October and November are huge harvest months. What we've found is typically when you start harvest in the Midwest, so I'm going to talk specifically about the Midwest here. When you start harvest in the Midwest, there's usually about a 40-day span to when you start harvest, finish harvest, and then get your fall field work done, your fall application, your tillage, anything you're going to do before the conditions just get too bad to do anything else. Maybe you have snow, maybe it's too cold, whatever. El Nino years shrink that by 20%. So you go from 40 days on average to like 32. And so we're concerned that this upcoming fall may have tighter windows to get work done, which means folks are going to have to push hard as they go forward into this fall, given that El Nino typically does that kind of behavior across a big section of the central part of North America.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I remember it wasn't too long ago that we had really wet weather in the fall, and we were actually combining after the snow melted, and we were dealing with a really compressed season, and it definitely impacts that harvest. So we've talked a lot, we've gone all across the globe and touched on what we should be looking out for through the summer and into the fall. What would you like to leave the listeners with?
There's two things, okay? I hate to say this, but we're not very good at our jobs. Like I had a group from Australia contact me last night, and they're like, "We need a 3-month forecast every day." I'm like, "Wait, that doesn't exist. Like I can't give you a 3-month forecast of every day as exactly what it's going to be." But they were making some huge plans, and I had to tell them, like, "Look, our forecast horizon in terms of being very skillful to tell you what to expect, maybe it's 7 to 10 days." Beyond 10 days, we can give you pretty good information on like the over-under, like, oh, it's looking warmer than average or cooler than average or wetter or drier. But that's it. I can't pinpoint rainfall amounts for you. Beyond that, when we get out there longer term, it's really just looking at these big global teleconnection events like El Nino. That's just one of them. We watch over a dozen of these things to try to just keep an eye on where things are going to go. So I guess what I'm asking is that as you consume weather information, understand our limits and predictability. They're real. And if you ever find a meteorologist that acts like they can predict everything perfectly, they're lying to you by virtue of talking. Because I'm gonna say something I probably shouldn't say, but I'm gonna say this. If I could perfectly predict weather out months in advance, I love working for Nutrien, but I wouldn't work for Nutrien. I'd work for no one. I'd be stupid rich being able to predict all this kind of stuff. But that's the nature of the beast. It's very difficult to do. I think the last thing I would share with folks is, hey, watch what's going on with El Nino and the way we're communicating about it, because it's going to be the main global climate driver going into the next 6 to 9 months. I think we just need to pay attention to what it could possibly give us for this upcoming winter.
Well, thank you very much, Eric, for your update. It's always very insightful. And I know as a farmer, everyone talks about the weather. It's our number one topic. And we're always wondering what's going to happen. And so we look forward to having you back again. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of The Dirt. And to learn more, check us out on Nutrien-eKonomics with a K.com.
Farming isn't farming without questions, and now there's a place to go for answers. At eKonomics, an entire team of agronomists are ready and waiting to help for free. No question is too big or too small. Visit Nutrien-eKonomics with a K.com and submit your question with the Ask an Agronomist feature. How can I tell a fertilizer investment will make sense for my operation?
Yeah, we have a couple tools that are free to use on our Nutrien eKonomics page. And one is starting with that soil sample. So one thing when thinking about a soil sample, think about it like a bank account statement for your ground. And so you can actually take that soil sample and assess which nutrients are low in the soil, which might limit your yield potential that year, and which ones are high. And so you can interpret that range and actually build out a custom fertilizer program and invest where you have a strong probability of a fantastic fertilizer response. And those are usually in those lower soil supply conditions. Conversely, you don't get a big of a return on your investment from fertilizer if you're putting fertilizer on top of a soil that has a high background soil supply rate. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in between, and those soil samples can really help you dial in which nutrients you need to focus on. The other piece we have to talk about is our input calculator that we just released. And this allows you to enter all of your information from your equipment spend, labor, fertilizer, crop protection. And you can put all your inputs in and actually see how do the inputs break out as a percentage of your total spend? Where are you putting your money? Which buckets are getting filled? And then start making some decisions on how does that actually go against your overall financial goals for the farm.
If you liked what you heard today, share this podcast with someone who would enjoy it. Your neighbor, a friend, or your crop advisor. Your support helps us keep these conversations going. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a rating wherever you listen.